It's been one heck of a week in politics this week. A damning report into Kāinga Ora that found it's not financially sustainable.
A scathing review has cleared the way for a major overhaul of the State Housing Agency.
Performance of the country's biggest landlord is deteriorating as it racks up billions of dollars of debt with little accountability.
The agency's debt ballooned fourfold over the past 6 years to $12 billion, and business as usual without savings or significant investment meant it was financially unsustainable.
What were they doing? Did not one of them have an ounce of common sense or just caution and say, look, seriously, look at this debt level?
So if Kāinga Ora was your business, you would have been shut down by the bank ages ago.
It's a bloody basket case, and we will be paying for the incompetence of the previous administration for decades and generations to come.
Kāinga Ora is a debt-ridden mess. That's been the story from the headlines and also straight from the Prime Minister.
It has a huge responsibility to house our most vulnerable New Zealanders, and it's been doing a very poor job of that.
The opposition, of course, has a different take.
Kāinga Ora has more debt, and they seem to be talking about that as a terrible thing. I mean, if you're building 13,000 more houses, the money for that doesn't come from nowhere.
We believe quite firmly that the government has a responsibility to provide housing. And if the funding continues at the level that it was, we would actually solve the housing crisis.
Kia ora, I'm Tom Kitchen, and today on The Detail, where does the truth lie when it comes to Kāinga Ora's finances? Is it really in financial strife, or is this a battle of politics? And what should the role of social housing be? Bernard Hickey is an independent financial journalist. He'll take us through the Kāinga Ora review and its implications.
This is a report commissioned by the new government almost as soon as it came in.
Today I have announced an independent review into the financial situation, procurement and asset management of Kāinga Ora.
It was led by Sir Bill English, the former Prime Minister and Finance Minister, and also former National Housing Minister, who really led the National Party's efforts to reform social housing between 2008 and 2017.
Some people cannot get social housing assistance when they need it. The provision of social housing is also dominated by Housing New Zealand, with relatively few other providers.
He's got another chance to recommend changes to how social housing is done, and in particular, what happens to Kāinga Ora, what was previously known as Housing New Zealand.
Why did the government feel it was necessary to do this review?
The government was concerned that Kāinga Ora's expansion under the Labour government had been not disciplined and had generated too much debt, and that it needed to be reined in and changed. There's also been some concerns in recent years that the cost of building new homes by Kāinga Ora was higher than the cost for private developments, and that it was too high, and that essentially Kāinga Ora was out of control, which is contestable, and certainly Kāinga Ora contested that. But that's the view of the government and of the independent. Well, there's a question about whether it is a true independent review in the way that many of us would know. An independent ministerial review led by a former judge or something is different to a review led by the former National Party Prime Minister and Housing Minister and the previous, political driver of policy on social housing.
So it sounds like the government maybe commissioned their mates to find exactly what they wanted to find.
Yes, as every government does. When they get into power, often they'll see something that they've said they want to change, but they want to have a really close look to make sure it's what they expected and that their changes might work. And that's partly what we got back with the review from Bill English. It was not only some statements about Kāinga Ora's sustainability, but also some recommendations about how things could be done differently, in particular removing the ability to build new houses from Kāinga Ora itself and looking to outsource that to community housing providers.
Do that completely?
Yeah, no, that's quite the plan change as far as I can see it. Although there's a lot of uncertainty, and this is one of the interesting things about this report, is that it came back with some very broad accusations.
A damning review of Kāinga Ora has painted a picture of an underperforming agency under weakened leadership and on an unsustainable financial path.
The Bill English review into Kāinga Ora lays it bare as to just how out of control the business is. In a nutshell, it isn't financially viable.
But did not provide a detailed plan for how Kāinga Ora was going to change, and that's still to be determined. It really was let's see what they come back with by the end of the year after we've changed the board. This isn't a company in the way that we might understand a company. Kāinga Ora is a standalone operation, albeit totally state-owned. It provides a service in the same way that you could accuse another government department of being financially unsustainable if it happened to increase its spending on its assets and its services under the control of the minister. For example, our Defence Forces, they've just bought lots of new planes and are planning to buy ships and other things.
Okay, so we're here at Jameson Field on Waiuru Military Camp. We have deployed 3 NH90s and 2 Augusta 109 helicopters, and we're here to test our ability to deploy these helicopters, the new helicopters.
Well, that's a big new expense. Now, it's not like they're going to make a profit on that. They're not. They're providing a public service, and it's pretty much the same for Kāinga Ora. So this accusation that it's not financially sustainable, that relies on some big assumptions about how big you think the size of government should be, how big you think the size of overall government debt should be, and what you think is a prudent level of overall government debt. And that is a matter for debate.
Well, let's talk about that debt, shall we? So the big headline figures that we've seen in the news.
Debt grew from $2.7 billion in 2018 to $12.3 billion in June last year, and is forecast to almost double that in 4 years' time.
23 billion in debt by 2028. That's what the forecast is showing for Kāinga Ora. Currently, the asset to debt ratio, it's about a quarter, right? Is that a good or bad thing?
Yeah, well, you could ask the same question of anyone who owns a home with a mortgage in New Zealand. A lot of people are able to borrow 95% of the value of their home.
Good news for first-home buyers who only have 5% deposit. One of the major banks, BNZ, has just opened up their doors for people or borrowers who want to buy with a low deposit.
You could argue, actually, that there isn't nearly enough debt inside Kāinga Ora, because for most people, they are able to borrow quite a bit more than 25% of the value of their home. And certainly, if you valued Kāinga Ora like any other home, you'd say to yourself, actually, it's been a stonking financial success over the last 5 or 6 years, because the value of its homes, in particular the value of its land, has risen much faster than the value of its debt. Just as every other homeowner in New Zealand can claim credit for unearned gains because land prices rose dramatically. This question of financial sustainability, if you placed the finances of Kāinga Ora and overlaid it on top of, a private company, and you looked at how its assets had gone from 30 billion or so to 45 billion, and its debt had risen by 7 or 8 billion, you'd say to yourself, gee, well, that's a win there, because you've managed to magic $7 or $8 billion out of nothing. Now, you could argue, well, no one's going to sell Kāinga Ora a holeless bolus to anyone. I bet there would be someone who would buy it, and some governments would like to sell it. In fact, the previous national government managed to sell some homes.
The government's extended the time it's giving social housing agencies to sign up for the planned sale of nearly 1,500 state houses. The Minister responsible for Housing New Zealand, Bill English, wants to hear by February just who is interested in buying the Housing New Zealand homes.
The national government in place from 1990 to 1999 also managed to sell some state houses. So the value of those state houses is professionally done and includes the same valuation techniques that people who own their own homes do. And if I said to a first home buyer that the most they could possibly borrow was 20% of the value of the home, they wouldn't be very happy.
My understanding is in the next, 50, 60, 70 years, the idea is to build more houses and, the value will increase, assets will increase, and debt will decrease quite significantly.
That's the idea. It's magic that you can somehow increase the number of houses and not take on any extra debt. If you said that to a regular person who was looking to buy a new house, they would say that's not possible, and neither would the bank. That's the irony here, is that The government says it wants to build lots of new houses, but doesn't want to do it with any of its own borrowings, which would be totally impossible for a regular home buyer who wasn't the government.
If they don't increase debt, what are the options to build more homes? How can they finance it?
Well, they can't. And that's the guts of it. There's no way that we can fill the infrastructure deficit that we have of, depending on who you listen to, the Infrastructure Commission.
In the decade to 2022, for every $10 we spent on new infrastructure in New Zealand, almost $6 of existing infrastructure wore out. That is the conclusion from a new report from the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, Te Waihanga.
Particularly with the sort of population growth that we have actually had in the last 20 to 30 years, our population growth of around 1.5% to 2% has been more than double what was expected by the official forecasters. And this means that we've got this huge hole to fill. Now, you could argue, well, let's use public-private partnerships and let's use private sector money to build all this infrastructure. Well, that's possible if you somehow believe that the private sector can borrow at the same cost as the government, but that's simply not true. The borrowing costs are anything from 50 to 100% higher for the private sector than the public sector, and that by necessity means you cannot build as much. So it's simply not possible to not only fix our infrastructure deficit and build the houses we need without debt, but it's also another massive case of magical thinking on the part of not just politicians, but voters as well.
So why can the government borrow at a less cost than, say, the private sector?
Because unlike you and me, we can't force everyone in the country to pay us taxes. And that's the beauty of having a sovereign credit rating when you're the government. It's always the best because you have the power to tax. That's the reason why people are happy to lend money to governments, because governments are the only bodies who are able to essentially force their customers to pay the money. It's actually a superpower. But unfortunately, governments of both forms for the last 30 years have been scared of their own superpower and chosen not to use it.
And why, Bernard? Are they just scared of public backlash?
Well, if you have higher debt, then your interest rates are slightly higher. And because government debt is the baseline for all interest rates, it means that when a government is slightly more indebted than it would otherwise have been, then interest rates are slightly higher than they otherwise would be, which means mortgage rates are slightly higher than would otherwise be. If you as a government believe your main task is to grow the tax-free capital gains of landowners in your society, if you think they are the ones you're in the job to look after, then your overall priority is to make sure that A, gains on the capital value of land remain untaxed, B, that you keep mortgage rates as low as you possibly can, because low mortgage rates inflate the value of land values and also improve the disposable incomes of people with mortgages. And you essentially run your economy and your government in the interests of landowners.
With these headlines about the debt, young people who may not have a mortgage and may not understand all this economics, they say debt, oh, public housing's bad, it's something we shouldn't be investing in.
For many of those people, they will hear what they're told, which is that Kāinga Ora is profligate, is wasteful, and is producing more houses, some of which will have to compete with your house when you eventually get it, if you do, and therefore that's a bad thing. However, in my view, New Zealand would be much better off if we had a lot more houses built, particularly social houses, ones that are more affordable, and people wouldn't have to pay so much money in rent. Because remember, we have the highest proportion of stressed renters in the world.
I didn't quite realise that. Where's that data come from?
The OECD puts out the data on what proportion of our poorer people are paying the highest proportion of their income in rent. And that's because our population has grown quickly and we haven't built lots of houses, and because our government is underinvested in infrastructure, which means we haven't got the land available for new homes. If the government were to do it another way, to have higher debt and to invest it more in infrastructure, the value of your land relative to the alternative would be lower. And that's the last thing you want as a government, is the value of residential land to be lower than it was before. Because remember, when you've got an economy, which is a housing market with bits tacked on, everything you do should be aimed at increasing the value of residential land, because that's how you maximise your wealth and ensure that you might have a chance of helping your kids into a home.
So this is all about maximising personal wealth, personal over the whole collective.
Yeah, because that's how we've run our governments for the last 20 or 30 years. We've been very upfront about it. We say we believe that a government should be run in the interests of individuals. Individuals should have more freedom to invest in what they think is the best thing, and that tax is theft. And that's what we have at the moment, a government which is ideologically driven to reduce the size of government.
That brings us back to the government's Kāinga Ora review. But Bernard says the last government had concerns about Kāinga Ora too.
They launched a review in the last year or so of the Labor government. They were concerned about the building costs and also the operational costs.
But if Labor had these concerns and National had these concerns, were they slightly different?
Yes. The National concerns were larger. They thought that Kāinga Ora was more financially unsustainable and more ill-disciplined than Labor thought it was. And obviously, National have a particular view to try to reduce the size of Kāinga Ora or Housing New Zealand's housing stock relative to the total housing stock, i.e. to reduce the size of government and to take housing more and more back into the private sector. And that is an ideological approach, and also to shift provision and building of social houses from pure state organisations, so Kāinga Ora, Housing New Zealand, to community housing providers. In my view, it's always good to have as many social houses as possible, and I think one of the drawbacks or flaws of the Labor approach was that it put all its eggs in the Kāinga Ora basket. It didn't help community housing providers that much. It really focused its activities on Kāinga Ora, and that left the community housing providers out to dry. Now, they are smaller than Kāinga Ora, probably a third at most of the housing places with community housing providers compared to Kāinga Ora. But they could have grown, and certainly there was a lot of appetite to grow, but not a lot of help from the then Labor government. In my view, if you're going to increase the number of social houses available, you need everyone to be building all at once, and you need the government to be helping community housing providers as much as possible. Remember that our population has grown by 200,000 in the last 2 years, but we've only built around about 50,000 houses. And that's on top of a massive housing deficit. So if you really want to solve this problem, you need everyone building everything all the time. The community housing providers, some would argue, are better at it than Kāinga Ora.
Chris Gladell is the Deputy CEO of Community Housing Aotearoa and is with us. Chris, morning.
Good morning, mate.
Chris Bishop was trying to do it yesterday. He was suggesting groups like yours do a better job, a more efficient job, and apart from that, dollars and cents. What is it you can do that Kāinga Ora allegedly can't?
I think what community housing organizations provide are those local connections. So you have, Maori organizations that are affiliated with a local Runanga or iwi that intimately know the area, know the people. Same with community housing providers that have often been providing other social services within a community for years or decades.
I think that's up for debate, and certainly a lot of the community housing providers have been quite effective at being landlords of people with all sorts of complex needs, whereas Kāinga Ora may not have been.
Do you think the end goal here of this government is to stop Kāinga Ora from building homes and make it all go to community housing providers in the private market?
I think the government wants to stop Kāinga Ora from growing, and it wants to stop it from increasing its debt and increasing the number of houses that it builds. And it's been very clear about that. It's said that the next 1,500 social housing places will go to community housing providers.
Budget 2024, as we know and as I've announced already, provides 1,500 new social housing places from the 1st of July 2025 onwards for places and groups like Dwell, registered community housing providers who do a great job housing some of our most vulnerable.
But that, remember, is half what Labor had promised through Kāinga Ora alone, about 3,000. So the net result of the government's decision so far is to halve the expansion of the social housing supply at a time when you could argue it needs to be doubled, not halved.
I mean, whose job ultimately is it to provide housing for people? Is it the market? Is it the government? Should it be a mix of all?
That's a question of ideology in the end. In New Zealand, as a practice, we think that it's a good thing that the state provides healthcare and education. For whatever reason, in the late 1980s, we decided that housing is not something that the state should be involved in a large way. To be fair, for most of our history, the state hasn't been involved in a huge way in our housing. It became a lot more involved after the 1920s in building state housing, and that was one of the reasons we eventually had relatively affordable housing by the 1980s. But when we stopped building social homes and putting the taxpayers' money into building new social homes, that's one of the reasons our housing started becoming more unaffordable, because the private sector does not build enough affordable homes. And that is a market failure, which is the same market failure all over the world. And that's why many governments get involved in social housing.
What do you predict, Bernard? What do you think the actions of the government will be? What can we see over this term of government and into the future?
I think the current government will build not many new homes, certainly less than the previous government, and the price of residential land will rise as a result. And the rents that will be earned from private rentals will be higher.
It might be good for people that own a home or own multiple homes, but in terms of the people at the other end of the scale, it might not be great for them.
No.
That's it for today. The Detail is funded by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders. Gwen McClure, Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer produced it. Thanks to Bernard Hickey. I'm Tom Kitchen. Mā te wā.